Ever since I was a teenager, I've hated it when people say, be nice. Or if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. I felt like these expressions were meant to shut me up and keep me from being my real self for the sake of the peacefulness of others. The nice girl sat quietly and smiled, did the dishes without being asked, and had no needs or preferences that would inconvenience anyone else. In a similar vein, as a new minister, I often diagnosed church groups or meetings with a case of what I called terminal niceness. And by that I meant that people systematically avoided speaking the truth or saying or doing anything prophetic because they didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable or upset. Such meetings felt like smothering in a room that was filled with the cotton batting that you stuff into pillows or teddy bears. There was little freedom in such rooms. Asking questions was dangerous. Suggesting change was absolutely forbidden. Advocating for, or even worse, being someone who didn't fit the status quo was not tolerated. Keeping silent was encouraged. Anyone who disrupted the fragile, fake peacefulness was swiftly punished with dirty looks and subtle or not so subtle cues that she should shut up. Admittedly, my reactions to these comments and situations, undoubtedly it reflected at least in part my own fragile self-confidence. And my assessment, probably partly true and partly untrue, that it was unsafe to be fully myself in these contexts. Whether those meetings and comments were really meant to be as oppressive as they felt to me, I cannot accurately assess now. Nevertheless, I think we have all encountered situations where mandatory niceness feels like a heavy blanket holding us down when we long to soar. And I think many of us would do better to be a little less nice some of the time, especially in the church where niceness gets extolled as a virtue, and yet being a prophetic witness is part of our calling as followers of Jesus. So let's ditch niceness in favor of being real, being truthful, being prophetic. Who knows how much change we might achieve for ourselves and the world. By contrast, however, I think we could do with a little more kindness. On the surface, this may seem contradictory, because in popular speech we often use kind and nice as synonyms. And some dictionaries will even tell you that they are. But I think from the perspective of faith and ethics, they're not synonyms at all. Sometimes they overlap, but they are very different things. Niceness is motivated by a desire to keep things pleasant, even if it requires suppressing our true needs and feelings and collaborating with a status quo that keeps the majority comfortable at the expense of the marginalized. Kindness, by contrast, is motivated by compassion. It is driven by a sense of human connection, one with another. And it requires us to be real and vulnerable and to truly understand, or at least seek to understand, what life is like for another. And real kindness is not always pleasant or nice. Setting a boundary with a difficult family member or coworker might be kind, but it can also be unpleasant, at least initially. Telling someone bad news in a clear and direct way may not seem like a nice thing to do, but it can be the most kind thing to do in a difficult situation. Being honest and upfront about our own needs and weaknesses might feel awkward or difficult rather than nice, but it can allow us to be genuinely kind to one another over the long haul, rather than superficially nice, with growing resentment and frustration seething just under the surface. Similarly, speaking out prophetically for those whose voice is not being heard is frequently disquieting to the majority. Because for sure, discovering that factors like racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, transphobia, ableism, xenophobia, and more mean that not everyone has the same opportunities in life, and that is not a nice thing to hear or to know. And even though being aware of those things can be very painful, in truth, it is our awareness that helps us to work together to build a kinder world. The phrase that the Maltese planning team for the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity picked out of this morning's Bible story as their focus was a simple one. They showed us unusual kindness. And that sentence has stuck with me all week as I've been pondering this story of the shipwreck of St. Paul from the book of Acts. What does unusual kindness look like? Who has shown me unusual kindness? Are there times when I have shown unusual kindness to someone else? So let's start by considering the phrase in the context of this morning's Bible story. Our story today is from the book of Acts, which is a bit like an adventure novel of the early church, with Paul as the main superhero. Before the passage we read today, Paul is in the temple with some friends when a mob starts beating him up. The Roman authorities hear about this and think that it's an uprising, so they gather soldiers to put down the uprising. In the midst of that, Paul is arrested, not for the first time. And arguments about jurisdiction begin over who has the authority to try Paul. And in the end, because Paul is a Roman citizen, read privileged person, they decide he has to be sent to Rome to be tried by the emperor. So Paul and some other prisoners, along with a Roman centurion and some soldiers, set sail for Rome across the Mediterranean Sea. They encounter headwinds and other struggles which mean that their travel is delayed, and this winter is upon them, the season when travel is not advised. Paul recommends stopping for the winter, but they decide to press on. But no sooner did they set out than a fierce storm blows up and they are afraid of being swamped. So they throw some of the cargo overboard to lighten the load. That makes the ship float higher in the water and it's less likely to capsize. Then when the storm continues, they are driven to despair and they believe that they are all going to die. Not an uncommon fate for sailing crews in bad weather at this time. Paul, however, reassures them that they will lose the cargo, but not their lives, and invites them to eat something to keep up their strength. Eventually, the ship runs aground on a sandbar near the island that they later discovered to be Malta. The soldiers intend to kill the prisoners before they abandon ship, but the centurion prevents them from doing so because he has befriended Paul and invites those who can swim to do so and gives the others planks and bits of the ship to allow them to make it to shore. Yes, one would assume that all sailors can swim, but that really wasn't the case in early times. So then they come ashore in Malta, and they are stunned by the kindness of the people. Because it is cold and damp, the islanders make a fire to welcome the wet refugees. In the midst of that, Paul gets bit by a poisonous snake which latches onto his arm, but does not kill him. As I said, this is the story of Paul the superhero. And this convinces the local people that Paul is a god. They are then invited to dinner at the house of the governor, who invites them to stay with him. The entire ship's complement spend the winter in Malta, and then when time comes to depart 3 months later, they find a ship that has been docked in Malta for the winter, and the local people outfit them with everything they need to continue their journey to Rome. So then, what does unusual kindness on the part of the Maltese look like in this story? Well, first it includes welcoming shipwrecked strangers. They don't know Paul, they don't know the soldiers, they don't know the sailing crew. These strangers swim to shore on the wreckage of their ship, and the Maltese make a fire and welcome them. And it also includes being willing to revise their first impression. Because the snake bites, or at least appears to bite Paul, they assume that he is a murderer and he will die from snake bite as a punishment from the goddess of justice. Yet when he does not succumb to the poison, he doesn't drop dead or otherwise turn black, they become willing to listen to his message. And it involves sharing provision with those who have been stranded on their island. And on an island, winter supplies are always a limited resource. When the shipping routes shut down for the winter, the ability to get new things also shuts down. Yet they share food and other supplies with Paul and the others, and even outfit them for their continuing journey when the shipping routes reopen. Well, those are not bad places for us to start if we want to live in a world with people who show unusual kindness. Showing unusual kindness requires us to welcome the stranger. To be truly kind to someone else, we have to recognize that they are not us, and what is kind for them may not be the same as what is kind for us. Genuine compassion is rooted in a sense of empathy for the experiences of others, even if they are very different from our own. Genuine kindness is grounded in our common humanity without trying to make us all the same. And showing kindness to ourselves also often requires a willingness to welcome the strange parts of our own experience and feelings. The emotions that surprise us, the decisions we never thought we would make, the experiences we initially thought we would never try. Showing unusual kindness also requires us to be willing to revise our first impressions. We might offer someone kindness only to discover that what they need is not what we have offered. We need to be willing to discover that we have misunderstood something. We need to be a people who continue to grow and learn. And showing unusual kindness also requires a commitment to sharing even when our own resources are limited. Kindness is revealed when we break bread together and resist the forces telling us that if we share with one another, there won't be enough to go around. And these same principles also connect with how the Canadian Food Grains Bank is an example of unusual kindness in our world, as they seek to overcome hunger in all places. You see, the work of the Canadian Food Grains Bank involves being kind to strangers. While documentaries like the one we will be viewing this afternoon strive to make the experiences of people in other parts of the world real and concrete and understandable for us, the truth is when you donate money or grain to the Canadian Food Grains Bank, you don't know where it will go. While some of their projects are long-term, the Canadian Food Grains Bank also responds to food emergencies around the world. When a flood or a drought or a war destroys food supplies, like the shipwreck did for Paul and his companions, the Food Grains Bank is there to help with emergency rations. And the work of the Food Grains Bank also involves learning and change and growth. For example, they hosted an exchange program in 2019 where farmers from East Africa gathered with Canadian farmers and agricultural researchers in Carman, Manitoba, to learn more about soil health and how farmers in each context can be good stewards of the land. Because overcoming hunger is not just about distributing food, but also about the production of food. And finally, perhaps most obviously, it involves sharing. One thing all people everywhere share in common is that we all need to eat. Food is essential to life. And all of our food comes from the earth. It is through sharing that we will be able to achieve the Food Grains Bank goal of a world without hunger. And this would truly be a triumph of human kindness if we could do that. So this week, let us take the time to notice and practice kindness. Let us get beyond niceness to a real, genuine, unusual kindness, because it is the only way that we will be able to work towards Christian unity and a world where all are fed. May God bless and inspire this work with courage. Amen.